Hey guys, welcome to the first video of my front-end development series. This series is for anyone wanting to learn web or front-end development. Maybe you just want to brush up your skills and you need a refresher. Hopefully this series or individual tutorials will be of some value to you. In this tutorial, our focus will be on HTML5. Welcome to the HTML5 tutorial. This course is designed for beginners and will cover everything you will need to know in order to build your first web page. This tutorial is primarily for any individual who has little to no knowledge about HTML5. There will be no CSS covered in this tutorial. We will focus on CSS in an upcoming video. The aim here is to give you the necessary skills to create HTML web pages, as well as the background knowledge to know when and how to use HTML5 according to best practices. When following along, remember to be patient. Everyone learns differently and at a different pace. Although HTML is easy, many might struggle to grasp the concepts at the beginning. So follow along, read additional books or documentation, and with little discipline and patience, you will eventually reach your goals. This tutorial contains everything you need to know, so once you start this tutorial, make sure you follow along to the end. I won't spend too much time talking about things that aren't important. I'll keep it simple, to the point, and explain to the best of my ability. Don't spend too much time trying to memorize any content we will be covering in this tutorial. That's not our goal here. To follow along in this tutorial, you can get by with a simple text editor and a web browser of your choice. HTML can be written using Notepad and it will work, but it is highly recommended to use a text editor for a more pleasant workflow. When it comes to text editors, we have a few options available to us. I will be using Visual Studio Code for the entire front-end development series which I will be doing. I would recommend using the same. However, any one of these will do. All the text editors mentioned are free to use, and it basically boils down to personal preference. Visual Studio is extremely powerful and allows for you to install various plugins and extensions that makes your coding experience much more pleasant. You can also customize the user interface, and it supports multiple languages and frameworks. Visual Studio Code is an overkill for learning HTML, but hopefully after using it in this tutorial you'll be more comfortable with this text editor when we start with our JavaScript tutorial. There are links provided for all the text editors in the description box below, so feel free to check that out. We also require a web browser because HTML runs in the web browser and does not require a special server in order to run. Again, any web browser will do the job. I will be using Google Chrome for the developer tools, which will come in handy once we start building our web pages. Now that we have that covered, we can start with a quick overview of what HTML5 is. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language and describes the structure of a web page. HTML also consists of a series of elements and tags that tells the web browser how to display or render the content. The browser will then know how and where to place the content on your web page. HTML5 is not a programming language. Programming languages contains some form of logic. HTML is just a markup language to tell the browser how to display your content and is often combined with CSS and JavaScript to build modern responsive websites or web applications. These languages are the core building blocks for creating any website or web application. Every single website, whether you're building a static website using HTML5, CSS and JavaScript, building a single page application using AngularJS or any other derivative of Angular, and even ASP.NET to build a web application, HTML5 will always be present, and it is the default markup language which describes the structure of the page. Let's start off by creating a new folder on the desktop, and we can call this HTML5. We can then go ahead and launch Visual Studio Code. If this is your first time launching the application, you will be presented with a welcome screen which contains a few links to getting started, as well as a quick overview of what features the text editor provides. You can go ahead and close the tab by clicking on the X icon in the corner. And what you want to do from here is navigate to the HTML5 folder that we just created on our desktop. Now, to do that, we can either click on the file icon or file tab in the corner and go to open folder, or we can click on the file icon and a window pane will open up on the left, and we can click on the open folder button and then navigate to the HTML5 folder we just created. You can now see that the HTML5 folder is open, and from here we want to go ahead and install a few extensions. Now, the extensions that we are about to install is really handy and will improve your overall coding experience and workflow when working with HTML5. To open up the extensions pane, all we need to do is click on the extensions icon in the bottom left of the pane or the menu. And the first extension we want to install is called Auto Close Tag. Now, by default, the size of this window is relatively small, so you can go ahead and extend it a bit, and you will see some more information about the extension as well as a small icon or image. There should be an install button over here. You can go ahead and click on it and the extension will install. Ultimately, what this extension does is it automatically adds an HTML closing tag to the element if there is one. HTML comes in opening and closing tags or start and end tags, and if the element contains a closing tag or an end tag, the text editor will automatically provide one. The next extension is called Live Server, and what this does is it allows us to launch a local development server with live reload functionality. Instead of us having to reload our web page every time we make changes to our code, with the Live Server extension, our page will automatically reload every time we save our changes within the text editor. So this is a nice to have when building web applications or websites. Now, most developers or programmers usually have multiple monitors set up, so you can have different applications open in full screen to avoid the hassle of opening and closing tabs in the browser or navigating through applications from the taskbar. If you are fortunate enough to have more than one display, you can have the text editor open on the one screen and the web browser open in another. This way you will be able to see any changes being applied automatically without having to open or minimize applications every time. For now, these are the only two extensions that we need. So we can go ahead and close that. And if it is that you want to change the theme of the text editor, you can go ahead and click on the View tab and go to Command Palette, and you can type in theme. So under Preferences, we can go to Color Theme, and by default these are all the built-in themes that Visual Studio Code has. So you can go ahead and pick whichever theme it is that you want based on personal preference. And that about covers it for the prerequisites to getting started and creating our first web page. Now, to go ahead and create our first web page, we can click on the file icon with the plus sign, and our first page will be called index.html. .html is the file extension which tells us what type of document it is, and index is the name of our file. Now, the root or home page for a website or web application is almost always index.html. This is the first page that opens when a user visits or views your website. Let's start off with a quick overview and the basic layout of an HTML5 page. You'll notice that once we start typing, there's this dialog box that pops up, and that is what provides suggested keywords. And if we go to the middle one, HTML5, and hit tab, it provides us with a skeleton or a mock-up of an HTML5 web page. I'm going to go ahead and save the changes, so Ctrl S. And what we want to do from here is open up our web page in our web browser. By default, it should be in the blue tab at the bottom of the text editor. There should be a Go Live icon. If it's not there, all you do is right click on the index file and go to Open with Live Server. And you can now see that over here our web page is opened in our web browser. Now, very quickly, in the URL bar we have an IP address 127.0.0.1, which just means localhost, so it's a local development server that is running, followed by our port number, which is 5500, and the name of our web page, which is index.html. I'm going to go ahead and explain the code that we have in front of us, which is just the basic HTML page layout. HTML is written in the form of HTML elements, which consists of markup tags, and these markup tags are the fundamental characteristics of HTML. Every markup tag is composed of a keyword, so in this case body, surrounded by the angle brackets. Okay, so you can see we have the keyword body, which is surrounded by the two angle brackets. HTML tags usually come in pairs, so you will see that there's an HTML tag and a closing tag, opening tag and closing tag, and there's an opening and closing tag for the head element as well as the body. Now, usually tags come in pairs, and the first tag would be referred to as the opening or start tag, and the second tag would be called the closing tag or the end tag. Now, an opening tag and closing tag are identical, except the closing tag has a / before the keyword, and this is basically to tell the browser that the command has been completed. I'm going to start off by explaining the first line of code that we have. The Doctype Html, that is a declaration that defines that this document is an HTML5 document, and all HTML documents must start with a doctype declaration. It only appears once at the top of the page and before any other HTML tags. Next we have the HTML element, and this is the root element of an HTML page. You can think of this as the entry point of your website. Next we have the head element, and this section contains a whole load of stuff to be preloaded before the rest of the page loads. Things like CSS libraries, JavaScript libraries, Bootstrap, fonts or icons, any external fonts or icons that you're using, Google Analytics, all those libraries would be listed in between the head tags or referenced in between the head tags. And this section can also contain metadata or meta information about the HTML page, but we will get more into detail when we reach the end of the tutorial. I will cover metadata and using the meta tags. Next we have the body element, and this defines the document's body and is sort of a container for all the visible contents, so things such as headings, paragraphs, images, tables, forms. Any visible content will go in between the body element. Now the title element that we have over here defines or specifies the title for the HTML page, which is shown in the browser's title bar or in the pages tab, and usually as the blue clickable text when your site is shown in the search engine results as well. What we're going to do is, or what we can do is, change this to HTML5, and when we save our changes you will see that our title has now updated to HTML5. Okay, so the title element sets the title of the web page. Like I mentioned earlier, HTML consists of tags and elements, and we would define an element in the following way. I'm going to use an example of a paragraph, and to define a paragraph we use the p tag, and then we can place some content in here. So let's just go, this is a paragraph. Okay, and save our changes. You can now see that our text is displayed on the web browser or on the web page. Now a tag would be the keyword surrounded by the angle brackets, and an element is everything from the start tag to the closing tag. In HTML we also have what is called empty elements, and these are elements which don't have a closing tag or an end tag, and an example of this would be the break tag. It's just BR for break, and this specifies a line break. Another element, an empty element, would be the image tag. That too does not have a closing tag. When it comes to opening and closing tags, a rookie mistake is always forgetting to add the closing tag to the element, or not adding the / in the end tag. And if you do this, the web browser would render the content differently. Now with the auto close tag extension that we installed, this is one less thing for you to worry about. You will notice that if I start typing and I define a paragraph again, as soon as I add the closing angle bracket, the text editor automatically adds the closing tag if there is one. Okay, so that's one less thing for you to worry about if you have the auto close tag extension installed. Now another thing to mention is the web browser does not display the actual tag. It's just there to tell the web browser how to display the content. So what is actually displayed is the content that goes in between the two HTML tags. Let's start off with headings. To define a heading in HTML, we will use the H1 to H6 element. So you can see we have H1, H2, H3 all the way down to H6. So what I'll do is I'll just define each of these headings. So H1 to H6. H5 and then H6. What I'm gonna then do is just place some content in between these tags. So we can go learning HTML5, and I'm just gonna copy the same content for each one of these elements. Okay, save our changes, and you can see the browser now displays our 6 different headings. Now in HTML Headings provides valuable information by highlighting important topics and also shows the structure of the document itself. H1 would define the most important heading and H6 would define the least important heading. Now, headings are important because search engines use the headings to index the structure and content of your web pages, and users often skim a page by its headings. So it's important to use headings to show the document structure and not to make your text look big or bold. Let's say, for an example, you have a paragraph and you want the specific size text and boldness. You should not use the H1 heading to achieve that. In CSS we have properties that can change or transform the actual text. So you can define the font size, you can define if you want it bold. All of those things are achievable using CSS properties. So headings should only be used for showing the document structure. Next, let's talk about paragraphs. A paragraph, like I mentioned earlier, is defined using the p tag, and you cannot be sure how HTML will be displayed. On large or small screens and as well as resize windows will all create different results. In HTML you cannot change the display by adding extra spaces or extra lines in your code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another paragraph. Now, if you are building a website or web application and you don't have the actual data that you should be working with, most developers will use dummy data. If it is, or if you type in low rem followed by a number and the number just specifies how many words you want and you hit tab, you will see that the text editor automatically generates some dummy data for us. So we'll just save our changes, and you can see our paragraph is now displayed on our web page. Now let's say we span this paragraph across multiple lines, and we save our changes. You'll see that the paragraph still renders the same. If we add any spaces in between our paragraph, save our changes, the web browser still displays the data the exact same way, or the paragraph. And this is because the web browser will automatically remove any extra spaces and lines when the page is displayed. Now, if it is that you want to span this across multiple lines, what we can use is the break element. So to define the break element, it's just a br tag, and again this is an empty element, so there's no closing tag. And when we save our changes, you can now see that our paragraph is spread across 4 different lines. Okay, so that can be achieved by using a line break, and to define a line break we use the br element. In HTML we also have what is called comments, and a comment is a piece of code which is ignored by any web browser, and it's always good practice to add comments to your HTML code, especially when you're creating a complex document. Comments can also be used to indicate different sections within a document, and as well as any other notes for anyone else looking at your source code, if it is that you're working with multiple different people. Comments also help you and others understand your code and increases code readability as well. To define a comment in HTML, we will start by adding the opening angle bracket followed by an exclamation mark and then 2 hyphens. Now you will notice that by default the text editor added the closing tag, which is the 2 hyphens and the closing angle bracket, and in between this is where your comment will go. So we can just say this is our headings in HTML5. Save our changes, and you can see the browser does not display the actual comment. If it is that you are creating a program or application and you're using a programming language, comments can also be used to describe what that particular piece of code does. And if it is that anyone else has a look at your code, or if you need to come back to change anything, then you can read your comment to know exactly what it is that that piece of code does. Okay, so comments in HTML is applied almost everywhere, or is very frequent. In HTML, we also have two different types of elements. Okay, we have inline elements and block level elements, and this affects how the browser renders the element. A block element is rendered as an actual block and can be as wide as it possibly can be, so it spans across the entire page from left to right and does not break across any lines. Now, the width and height of the element can be changed or regulated, and block level elements may contain inline elements as well as other block level elements. And an inline element can be described as an element which is placed inside another element without it spanning across the entire page. A quick example of this would be using the div element, and this is one of the most commonly used block level elements. So to define the div element, we use the div tags, and div is just short for division and is most often used to separate different types of content on your web page. From here we can go ahead and define, let's say, a H3 heading, and we can say welcome to my first tutorial. We can also then go ahead and define a paragraph and add some dummy data. So lorem 15, tab, and then maybe define one more paragraph. Okay, lorem 10. Go ahead and save our changes, and you can see we now have our div element that is displayed, and we have our heading followed by our two paragraphs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a horizontal rule, which is just a solid line across the page, just so that we can separate our content, or rather the elements that we're talking about. Now, when I go to launch the developer tools in Chrome, you can click on the three dots, go to more tools, and then developer tools, or just Ctrl+Shift+I for a shortcut. Now, when we go to the div element, when we hover over the div element, you can see that the blue block on the screen spans from the left all the way across to the right of the screen. Okay, so irrespective of how large or small the screen is, the div element still spans across the entire page. So that is what is referred to as a block level element. Now, an inline element could be something like the strong element, which basically transforms the text to bold. So I'm going to place some text in between these tags, save our changes, and you can now see that these three words are in bold. Okay, so this is an inline element, an element which does not span across the entire page from left to right. Now, the div element is used as a container that can apply formatting anywhere you want on your web page. and a lot of developers will use or make use of divs or div elements and assign it with an ID. Now the limitation of this is the div element does not tell you anything about the actual content, so the web browser knows that it has found a separate section but not what kind of section. And in HTML a lot of new elements have been introduced, and some of them are here to replace the use of the div element. This is where semantic elements comes into play. An example of a semantic element would be the article element. Another one is the footer and the navigation. Now there are multiple different semantic elements in HTML5. Again, you can just refer to the cheat sheet in the description box. So if you haven't downloaded that, you can go ahead and download it and just make reference to that. There is a complete list of all the semantic elements that HTML5 offers. Now when the browser reads these elements, the browser knows that this piece of content is an article, this piece of content is a footer, and likewise this piece of content is a navigation tab or a navigation pane. And when you have a look at the div element, it does not tell you much about what type of data this is. So you can go ahead and define an article using the div element or the article element, and both would be displayed the same or render the same. It's just that the web browser does not know what type of content this is. Okay, so using semantic tags, all that is keywords which describes the type of content that it has. Next, let's have a look at HTML links. In HTML5, links basically allows users to navigate their way from page to page, and you can use links to jump to or open up another document, and these can be web pages that is hosted within your website, as well as external links, so things like YouTube or Facebook or any other external website that is hosted on the internet. To define a link, we will use the anchor tag. Okay, that is how we define a link. And links take on what is called attributes. In HTML5, many different elements can have attributes, and an attribute provides additional information about the specific element, and they're always specified in the start tag or the opening tag. And usually attributes come in name value pairs. So what I mean by that is name followed by a value. Okay, so the name attribute or the name of the attribute and then followed by the value. So the first attribute that a link would take is the Href attribute, and this specifies the path to the page where you want the user to navigate to. So let's say, for example, if we go ahead and open up Samsung's website. Okay, let's just go back one and do Samsung. Okay, just go ahead and grab the URL in the URL bar. You can say copy and then paste it in between the double quotation marks. Okay, next we just want to define the text that is displayed on our web page. We can just do jump to Samsung. Okay, save our changes, and you can see we now have some clickable text on our web page, and when you click on it, it will navigate to Samsung's web page. Okay, another attribute that this can take is called the target attribute, and if we specify or set the value to blank, what this does is, instead of the link opening up in the same tab, when you click on the link it opens up a new tab. Okay, so if it is that you don't want your users to open up the link or the web page that you're navigating to in the same tab, you can use or specify the target attribute and assign the blank value, and every time you open or click on the link it will open up in a new tab. Another attribute that the link element takes is the alternate or alt attribute. Now there are two different ways to specify a link in HTML5. The first type is using an absolute URL, and the second one is using a relative URL. Now an absolute URL is a link to an external source, so external website or external image, and a relative URL would be links to internal sources, so any web pages or images that is hosted within your website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and define another link, assign it to Href Attribute, and then in order for us to provide a working example, let's go ahead and create another page, and we'll call this about.html. And again, we just want to provide the basic page layout, so HTML5, hit tab. We can then go ahead and change the title to, let's say, about, and then let's just define an h1 heading. Okay, save our changes. Now when we go back to our link, so remember that we're now specifying a relative URL. Now because the about.html web page is within the same folder directory or the root directory, we can just go ahead and type about.html and then just call this about. Okay, save our changes, and you can see we now have the about link over there. Let's just add a break. There we go. So when you click on the about link, it will navigate to the about.html page that we just created over here. Okay, so this is using a relative URL. Now a quick tip: whenever you're building a website, it's always best to use relative URLs. The downside of using a absolute URL is, number one, copyright violations. So you don't always have permission to use certain images, so you may be in violation of copyright laws, and you also cannot control any external images or links. So let's say, for example, if the image is removed or the website's URL changed, then that will break your website, because now that image or web page is no longer available at that particular URL. So that is something that you have no control over. If it is that you're using a relative URL, you are always in control of the content that is hosted on your website. Okay, so it's always best to use relative URLs because they won't break the domain if you make any changes. We can also use an image as a link. To do this, we again define an anchor tag, and inside this we will add our image tag or our image element. Okay, let's just navigate back to the index page. Now the image element takes the source attribute, which specifies the path to your image. Again, we can either use a relative URL or an absolute URL. So let's just go ahead and grab an image from the internet. Samsung Note 20 Ultra. Okay, so right click on the image, copy image address and paste it in between the double quotation marks, and we can go ahead and save our changes. Okay, and you can see we now have our image. The image element takes on another two attributes, so you can specify the height as well as the width of the image. So let's just go 200 pixels for the width and 150 pixels for the height. Save our changes, and you can see our image is now resized. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a few break elements below this link. Now, in a real world scenario, if it is that you want padding or a margin between certain elements, you wouldn't use the break element to achieve that. To define padding and margin, we have CSS properties for that. So you would never use the break element or a line break to define or set padding to or between elements. This is purely just for demonstration purposes. Now, okay, so you can see our image was resized to the values that we specified. And one last attribute that the image element takes is the alt attribute, and this is short for alternate text, and usually this is a description about the image. So let's just say Galaxy Note 20 Ultra. Okay, save our changes. Now the purpose for this attribute is if for whatever reason our image is not available, the alternative text will be displayed. So I'm going to remove some characters from the link and save our changes. So you can see it now displays the alternative text because the image is not available. And like I mentioned, this is one of the downsides of using a absolute URL, because you have no control over an image that is hosted on the internet. Okay, so from here we can go ahead and assign an Href attribute to the anchor tag, and again we can just use the link from Samsung's website. And then just use the target attribute again, so it opens up in a new tab. Save our changes. Now when you hover over the image, you can see that we have this hand that appears, which tells us that the image is clickable, and when you click on the image it will navigate to the Samsung website. Okay, so you can use images as links as well. And then one last way to use a link is to navigate to different sections within a web page. So let's say for an example, if we have multiple paragraphs, or let's say we have a single page website, and in this website you have different sections. So we have a home section, an about me section, a section for products, a section for services, and so on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define a paragraph very quickly, and let's just add some dummy data. So let's do 20. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this so that we have the ability to scroll on our web page. So I'm just going to duplicate a few paragraphs. Okay, so you can see we now have the ability to, let's do a few more, to scroll on our web page. Okay, so Like I mentioned, we can also use links to navigate to a section in our web page, and to do this we will use an ID. Now let's say we want to jump to our headings, and remember this can be anything. It can be, you can specify a set of links in the navigation, so home, about, product, services, and when you click on that link it takes you to the services section or the product section or the about me section. So to do this we specify an ID, and we can give it the value of, let's say, headings. And when we go to the bottom of the page, let's just create another paragraph, and we can say jump or view how to use headings in HTML5. What we can then do is we are going to wrap this with the anchor tag. So remember, it's a link. Okay, we can save our changes. So you can see our text is now displayed. Now from here we can assign the Href attribute, and we now want to point to the ID that we just assigned. So the ID that we assigned to the H1 element. Okay, and the value of that is headings. And all we do is we just go hash symbol and headings. Or was it heading? Okay, headings. Now when we save our changes, you will see that this now appears as a link, and when we click on it, it takes us back to our headings. Okay, so we are assigning an ID here, and we're just calling the value over here. So this is how we can use links to navigate to a section in our web page. Now before we move on, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove some of these paragraphs that we just created on our web page, because it does look a bit untidy. And then again I'm just going to add a horizontal ruling between all of our different elements. Okay, and then again just have a few break elements as well. Okay, now before I carry on, let's just go through a few semantic elements, some examples of using semantic elements. Now the first element we can have a look at is the Nav element, and to define a set of, the Nav element defines a set of navigation links, and to define a navigation link we would use the anchor tag, and again we assign it an Href attribute, and let's just point or use relative URLs and point to the about.html page, and we can say about. Okay, let's just create another page. We can call this contact.html, and again assign the basic HTML page layout, change the title to contact, and then define a heading. Okay, save our changes. Now we can go ahead and define another link, assign it the Href attribute, and then point to the contact.html page, and just put down contact. Okay, save our changes, and you can see we now have a set of links. So when we click on about, it navigates to the about page, and when we click on contact, it navigates to the contact page that we just created now. Okay, I'm going to move this to the top of the page just so that we have some sort of flow going here. Okay, so you can see there's our two links that we added. The next element we can have a look at is using the article element, and this defines an article. Now usually an article would have a heading with some paragraphs, maybe some links, and can include an image as well. Let's go ahead and define an H3 heading, and we can just say Galaxy S21 Ultra release. Okay, let's specify or define a paragraph and insert some dummy data. H220. And then maybe define a link as well. So href, and again we can just use Samsung's URL. Specify the target attribute, set it to blank, and then say view more. Actually read more. Okay, save our changes, and you can now see we have our article over here. So our H3 heading followed by our paragraph, and then we have our link, read more, and when you click on it, it navigates us to Samsung's website. Okay, we can also go ahead and add an image. Again, the source attribute to specify the path. Let's just grab a different image, maybe this one. Copy the image address and then paste it in between the double quotation marks. And again, we're going to set the width and the height. So the width and the height attribute. The height we can set to 150 pixels, and the width maybe 250 pixels. Okay, when we save our changes, you can see we now have our image as well. Again, don't forget the alternative text, and we can say S21 Ultra. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and we can just maybe duplicate this. So add a horizontal rule to separate the two articles, paste, and then maybe just grab a different image. So copy image address and then just replace it with this URL. Save our changes, and you can see we now have our second image as well. Galaxy Note 20 Ultra release. Okay, let's just change the heading. Okay, so you can see we now have our two articles as well. Another element we can have a look at is the footer element, and this defines a footer in a website or a web page. And the footer usually contains things like copyright information, contact information. You can have a sitemap or back to the top links. You can define anything within the footer. Okay, so let's just define a paragraph and have author, and say coding with Mo, and let's maybe have a set of navigation links. So again, we just define the nav element, and let's just grab these two relative URLs and paste it there. Okay, so you can see we now have our footer. Obviously this is now raw HTML, so there's no CSS or any styling involved. So this would be our paragraph, and then here we're defining our navigation, our two links. Again, if you click on it, it will navigate to the relevant page. Okay, next let's move on to lists. Okay, let's just separate that. And again, let's just add some break elements so that we can separate our content. There we go. Now, in HTML5, we have two types of lists. We have an unordered list and an ordered list. To define an unordered list, we would use the UL tag, which is short for unordered list. And we then have an LI element, which stands for list item. So for every item on the list, we will have an LI element. I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this. Let's add 3 items. And let's say we can go with, let's do some food stuff. So chicken, steak, and let's do beef. Okay, save our changes. And you can now see we have our unordered list over here with our 3 list items. The second type of list is an ordered list, and that is defined using the OL element. And again, we would have a list item. And the only difference between these two lists is an unordered list has the bullet points by default, and generally you can style this how you want to according to preference using CSS properties. And the ordered list obviously have or replaces the bullet points with a number system. Okay, so you can place whatever it is you want inside the unordered list or the ordered list, and you can have as many items as you wish. Next, let's move on to tables. Now in HTML, tables should only be used for rendering data that naturally belongs within a grid. And when structuring tables, the HTML markup is basically structured with rows and cells. To define a table, we use the table element, and then we would define a table row, which is defined using the TR element. And then we would have a TD element, which stands for table data. So this is where the actual content is. Again, we can have multiple entries of data. So let's do cars, we can have Toyota, let's do BMW, and then VW. Okay, save our changes. And you can now see our data is displayed there. I'm going to go ahead and just style the table very quickly. I know we're not covering CSS, but just so that you can see the columns and the rows within the table. Okay, so I'm going to reference the table element and table data. I'm going to specify a border of 1 pixel, solid border, and set the color to red. Okay, so you can now see that we have our row and our 3 columns, okay, with our table data. Now, one thing I didn't cover yet is classes and IDs. I know we spoke very briefly about how to use an ID in HTML, and we never spoke about classes. Now, a class attribute is used to specify a class for an HTML element, and multiple HTML elements can share the same class. Usually the class attribute is used to point to a class name within a style sheet, and it can also be used by JavaScript to access and manipulate elements with the same class name. So I'm going to give an example. So let's just do the h2 heading. So define the class attribute and give it a value of let's say red heading. And all this is this is how you would define an internal style sheet. And what we would then do is, so dot, what is the name, so red heading, and let's just do color and set it to red. Okay, so you will see our heading is now in red. The basics behind this is we're assigning a class to an element and we're giving it a value. We're then calling the name of that value within our style sheet and assigning it the color property. So again, this is just properties and values. So you define the property, the CSS property, and you set the value. IDs are used for the exact same thing. Oh, and again, classes can be used on multiple elements. So if we copy this to the paragraph, save our changes, you can see our paragraph is in red as well. Okay, so a class can be used on multiple elements. An ID works the exact same way. The only difference is the ID attribute is used to specify a unique ID for an HTML element, and you cannot have more than one element with the same ID within an HTML document. Again, the ID attribute can be used to point to a specific style declaration within a style sheet, and can also be used by JavaScript to access and manipulate the element with that specific ID. So we can use the same ID that we have here, that we assigned to our heading earlier. So hashtag, and the name of this ID that we defined here was headings. So we'll just go headings, and let's change the color as well to blue. Okay, save our changes, and you can now see that the text of, or the color of the text of our H1 heading is now in blue, where we assigned this ID. Okay, so this would be for something very unique that's only going to be used once within the entire HTML document. To call or reference a class, we use the dot followed by the name of the value. Value of the CSS class is case sensitive as well. So all we're doing is we're using the dot to reference the class followed by the value of the class name, and for an ID we would use the hashtag followed by the value of the ID as well. And then in between these curly braces we're defining the CSS properties or CSS rules. Okay, so I'm just going to remove that and then remove this as well. So coming back to our tables, if it is that we add another table row, you can see another column, another table row was added, and there's now not the extra column but the extra data field. So we can have multiple table rows within this table, and again, tables should only be used for rendering data that naturally belongs in the grid. So we could have, for an example, employee data, and we would have a name, surname, age, occupation, the manager they report, or the department they're in, and then we just reference all of our data underneath that headings. Now another thing we can do is, instead of using the TD, if it is that we want headings like I just explained, instead of using the TD element we use the TH element, which is short for table heading. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and change this to table heading, save our changes, and you can now see that we have our 3 headings over there. And then from here we can go ahead and list all of our data. Okay, so over there we have our heading, followed by our 4 data fields. Now there is another way to define a table in a more semantic way, and again we define a table using the table element, and from here, instead of using the table row element, we would use the table head and the table body element. Now to define that, we use the t head element, and inside the t head element we would define the table row. Okay, and again table data for each heading that we have, or rather th for table head, sorry, th for table heading. Okay, let's just duplicate this again, and then let's maybe do name, age, and car. Okay, so you can see we have, let's just add a break element. So you can see we have name, age, car, and then outside of the t head element we would define the table body, which is defined using the t body element, and again we have the table row and our actual table data. Okay, so here we can go ahead and insert the name. So let's go Cindy, age 24, and car is a BMW. Okay, save our changes, and you can see it's displayed the exact same way. So this is a more semantic structured table, this way here. Okay, so this is using a more semantic approach. Both ways are correct, both ways will work as well. Next, let's have a look at multimedia in HTML5. Multimedia on the web can refer to music, videos, movies, as well as images. Now, for this entire explanation on all of these elements that fall under multimedia, we're going to be using relative URLs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder and call this media, and what I'm going to do is I have downloaded a few multimedia, and I'm just going to paste it in the folder that we just created. So if you open up the HTML5 folder on the desktop, and we can see the media file or the folder that we just created, and just paste the content in there. So I have 3 images, I have a video, and I have an MP3 file. Okay, so multimedia refers to, like I said, images, music, videos, movies, as well as animations. Now, we already spoke about images. To define an image, we use the image tag, followed by the source attribute, which specifies the path of the image. Now, because the image is not in the same root directory, it's not in the root directory, and it's within a folder, we will use / to specify that we need to go or move forward one directory, and then go to our media folder, and there's our image. Okay, save our changes. You can now see our image is displayed over there. Again, we specify the width and the height attributes, and let's go with 200 pixels for both values. Okay, so you can see our image size changed. There we go. I'm just going to add again a few break elements, as well as a horizontal rule. There we go. Now that is how we would define an image. Next, let's have a look at the video element. Now to define a video, we use the video element, And within the video element we have the source element. Okay, so it's an element, not an attribute. So we specify the source element, and this is where you would specify or define the different file formats of your video. So within the source element, it takes on the source attribute, which is the path to your video. So in this case, again, you want to jump one directory forward, go to media, and then fast9. The next attribute that the source element takes is the type, and here we're defining the type of source, which is a video, and the file format, which is MP4. Okay, we can then save our changes, and you can see our video is now embedded in our web page. If you go to the video element, we can specify the width and the height. So for width, let's go with 300 pixels, and for height 250. Okay, so you can see our, let's maybe make it a bit bigger, 450 maybe. Make the width 400. Now you'll notice that we don't have any controls to play the video. If you want the video to play automatically, we can add the autoplay attribute. Save our changes, and you can see that the video plays automatically.
And we change too.
Using the controls attribute, if we save our changes, you will notice that we now have controls at the bottom of the screen, and it's some basic controls. So we have a play button, so play and pause. We also have a volume rocker, and then a download button to download the video, and to view the video in large or in full screen. And when we click play, our video loads.
The world has come back together.
We heard y'all needed a little love out here.
Okay, so that is how we would embed a video in our web page. When it comes to the source element, for whatever reason, let's say the web browser does not support MP4, we can specify alternative formats. So we can say M4A, I think that's MP3 or audio file format. Whatever other movie or video format you get, you can specify here. Okay, another one would be OOG. Okay, so these are all the different formats. So if for whatever reason the browser does not support MP4, it will move over to the MOV. If it does not support MOV, it moves over to the OOG format. And if the web browser does not support any of these, in between the video tags you can just add text and say your browser does not support this video. So if the web browser does not support any one of these file formats, this text will be displayed within the placeholder. Okay, so this is how you would define a video in HTML5. Next, we can go ahead and define an audio file, and to do this we use the audio element. So audio, and again the same principles apply. We would add controls. Okay, so we have the basic controls to play and stop our MP3 as well as the volume rocker. Now again we use the source element, so we can define the different types of audio formats that we have, and it takes on the source attribute. So we'll just navigate to our MP3 audio file, or M4A audio file, and again we specify the type, which is now audio, and the type of audio file is M4A. Okay, save our changes. Let's just add a break element. Okay, and you can now see that we have our audio file embedded within our page. Okay, the audio file needs to be MP4, I think. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you can see we can start and stop our song. We also have the option to control the volume as well as download the MP3 or MP4 file. Okay, so that is how you would define an audio file in HTML5. Next, let's move on to forms. That's one of the last things that we need to cover in this tutorial. Okay, again, let's just add some break elements with the horizontal rule. And let's start off with forms. Now, an HTML5 form is used when you want to collect some data from your user or site visitor. Let's say, for example, you want to collect information like name, email, and cell phone number during registration, or you might have a contact form and you want to collect the details and the message from the user. Then we would use forms to provide us with a service. Now, a form is simply an area that contains form fields, and a form field is an object which the user can add information to, whether it be a text area, a radio button, a drop down menu, some checkboxes. There's quite a few different form fields that we get. And any web form essentially works the same way. The user fills in some information and then clicks on a submit or a send button. A web form consists of two parts. We have the front end, which is the HTML, and a back end form processor. Now, HTML will handle the presentation, while the back end handles the actual form submission, so the processing of the actual form data that the user just filled in. The back end of the form is usually written in languages like PHP or ASP.NET, or we can even use form mail, which is usually accessible through your ISP or internet service provider. And if not, there are several free and paid services out there that you can choose from. Now, our main focus will be just the presentation of the form, of the HTML form. And to define a form in HTML, we use the form tag. And inside this two tags is where we would define all the different types of input elements. The form element takes on two main attributes. The first one is the action attribute, and this is usually the script that handles the form processing, so the actual processing of the data, the form data. And this will be a link to the PHP file or the ASP.NET file. And then the second one is the method, which is usually get or post. Most of the time we would use the post method, because let's say you want to add all the user's details into a SQL database, then we would use the post method, which is obviously most secure. Using the get method on a form is not recommended because it's not secure, and usually all the data that the user inserted within your form is displayed in the URL of the web browser. Okay, once we get to our JavaScript tutorial, I'll go into more detail. Now, the form element is a container for all the different types of input elements, and the first element that we can look at is the label element. And the label element defines a label, and we can say, let's do first name and last name. Okay, so first name, and let's do a last name. Okay, we then define an input element, and the input element represents a type data field which the user can edit. And the type attribute defines which input state you are using. So after we define our input element, we define or we add the type attribute, and you can see we have a whole bunch of different input types that the form field can take. So in this case it's just random text, and the same thing for the last name. So we define the input element and type text. Okay, save our changes, and you can see we now have a form field that we are able to now edit. I'm going to go ahead and add a break element. Okay, so now it's one on top of the other. The next input type we can have a look at is checkboxes. So again, we define a label, and let's say we want to check what type of cell phone device we have, or cell phone brand. Okay, so we can go with Samsung. Let's do iPhone or Windows. No, that's not. Okay, let's just do brands and LG. Okay, so again, this is to define a checkbox. So from here we define the input type element, and we assign the type checkbox, and we'll do the same for the other two brands of devices. Save our changes, and you can now see we have the ability to select which type of device we have. Okay, so you can now select, usually it's the other way around, so you'll have the input type first and then the label. So let's just do that very quickly. Okay, so usually you'll have the input type first and then the label. Okay, so we need to place that over there. Okay, because the label is now the last element. There we go. Okay, so you can now select which type of device it is that you have. Okay, so that is how you would define checkbox. The next input type we can have a look at is a drop-down list. In order to define a drop-down list, we use the select element. Okay, so select, and we also have inside the select element an option element. Now the option element defines an option that can be selected. So again, we'll just duplicate this. We have let's say three different options, and let's just go with cars again. So Toyota, BMW and Subaru. Save our changes, and you can now see, let's just add another BR tag. There we go. So you can now see we have a drop down list, and when we click on it, we have the option to select whichever car it is that we have. Now again, we can just define a label and say select your car. Okay, so select your car, and now you can go ahead and select the type of car you have. By default, the first option is, or the first item in the drop down list is selected. So if it is that you want to have a predefined option, we can add the selected attribute to the options element, and you'll now see that BMW is the predefined option instead of the first option within the list. We can also have a text area, and the text area is defined using the text area element, and the text area element takes on two main attributes. The first one is the rows, which specifies how many rows we want, so we can say 20, and then columns. So this is basically defining the size of the text box, and let's go with maybe 10. Okay, so you can see we now have, okay, it's actually the other way around, so 10 rows and 20 columns. There we go. Let's maybe do 80. Okay, 80 is too much. 50. There we go. Okay, so again I'm just going to add a few break elements. So now you can see we have our text box over here, and we can go ahead and add our message. Okay, we can also have a placeholder attribute, and to do that we define the placeholder name, and over here is where we'll define the actual text for the placeholder. So we can do something like complete the form and add your message here. Well, let's just do message here. Okay, when we save our changes, you can see we have message here that is grayed out, and once you start typing it disappears. So that is basically a placeholder to let the user know what information should go within that particular form field. We can also have or add the disabled attribute. The input disabled attribute specifies that an input field should be disabled, and a disabled input field is unusable and unclickable. So for whatever reason, if it is that you want to disable an input field, we just add the disabled attribute, save our changes, and you can now see that the first name input area is grayed out, so you can't edit or add any text within that. If it is that you want to allow a user to update a file to your website, you will need to use a file upload box or a file select box, and this is created using the input type, the input element, and the attribute or the type attribute is set to file. So let's do an example quick. So we'll add a label, and we can say add your profile pic. Okay, again let's just have two break elements. Okay, so add your profile pic, and like I said, we define our input element and of type file, and if we save, you can see we now have the ability to choose a file, and we can go ahead and select whichever file it is that we want. Okay, whether it be an image or your CV that you're uploading, whatever it is, whatever type of input file. Okay, so that would be how we define an input file box or file select box. We can also have a button. Usually there's a send or submit button, and to do this we would have to define an input type or input element, sorry, and the type would be submit. Okay, this is if you want to submit the form. So if we save, you can see we now have a submit button at the bottom, okay, which obviously at this point in time does nothing. So after completing all of these different forms, adding your text, selecting your file, we can go ahead and click submit, and it will run the script that we specified or defined in the action attribute. When it comes to form validation, validation attributes allow us to specify various kinds of rules on our form elements. For an example, let's say within the first name, we can set that the maximum amount of characters is set to 50, and we can also have that there's no characters like, you know, exclamation marks or the @ symbol or the hashtag or percentage. There's none of those characters are allowed. So just your normal A to Z text. So you can set the minimum length and the maximum length as well of a text field. And most of the time we wouldn't use, although HTML5 has form validation attributes, we would always use JavaScript for form validation because it provides more ways to customize and set the validation rules. Now in JavaScript, form validation, basically we define functions to validate the data before submitting it to the server, and we can implement any logic required for achieving the validation rules. JavaScript is also more flexible in this way because there's no restriction on defining the rules. So once we start with the JavaScript tutorial, we will cover form validation in detail, and I'll provide some working examples as well. For the last part of this tutorial, I'm going to go back to the metadata. Okay, I'll just remove this styling, which we don't need, and I just want to explain the type of metadata that we can have and how to use the meta tags or the metadata tag. Metadata gives the web browser more information about the HTML page. For an example, you can specify the author of a web page, you can have a page description, and even refresh the web page every 30 seconds if you wish to. Now the first meta tag that we have the charset attribute, and we're setting the value to UTF-8. The charset attribute is used to specify the character encoding of your content, and an HTML page can only have a single character encoding, and for most web pages you should use the UTF-8. You can also define the description or a description of your web page, and that would be done, so we would define the meta tag, we define a meta tag, and we would add the name attribute and call this description, and then the content attribute. Now in the content attribute you can specify or give the description of your web page. So let's assume you're creating a website that provides tutorials. In this section we can say free tutorials on web development. Okay, if you search for a particular website on the internet, underneath the blue clickable link there is usually a short description about the website. So that is how this is done. Okay, so using in defining the meta tag and setting the name attribute, and then followed by the content attribute, and that is where you would define the actual description of your HTML web page. If we have a look at this meta tag over here where we have the viewport, basically what we're doing here is we're setting the viewport to make your website look good on all devices. Now the viewport is the user's visible area of a web page, and obviously it varies from device to device. So it will be smaller on a mobile phone versus the size on a computer screen. If you have a look at the content, the value of the content attribute, where we have width equals device width, this part sets the width of the page to follow the screen width of the device. Again, it will vary depending on the type of device that you're using. And the initial scale equals 1. That sets the initial zoom level when the page is first loaded by the web browser. Okay, so that's just some of the basic meta tags that you would have on an HTML5 web page. And that would conclude our HTML5 tutorial. Hopefully you are able to learn something and benefit from the content I provided. I try to cover most of the topics you would need in order to create your first web page, and this should provide you with an understanding of how HTML works and how to create a web page using the various HTML elements. This is my first tutorial, and I only aim to create better and more fluent tutorials going forward. I am still playing around with audio settings. My video editing skills are also not the best, and it goes without saying that as I create more content, the overall quality will improve. Once I have a setup which works for me audio and video editing wise, I will start creating scripts to read from, and that will ensure a more fluent tutorial. If you learned anything or benefited from this tutorial in any way, leave a like and comment on what you thought about the tutorial. Any positive criticism is always welcomed, and at the end of the day we are all in the process of learning. Also, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the next video of the series. From here we'll move on to CSS and build a basic website using these two front-end technologies, so HTML and CSS. And yes, thank you for watching my HTML5 tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.